All right. There you go. So if you're not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit working across various sectors in Canada, Turtle Island, and globally to foster effective, responsible, and collaborative use of data and technology, as well as to solve complex problems, right? I just wanted to acknowledge that we're based on the land of St. Lawrence, the Iroquois, Mohawk, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee peoples on what is now known as the island of Montreal. We acknowledge that Indigenous people who prior to and after the arrival of the French encountered one another on the territory and on the island of Montreal. All right, so what is an open smart community? It's a really important concept, right? So as smart cities became more and more popular, we realized that city stakeholders and decision makers were faced with options that would be rather top-down, privatized, and that would put solutions before problems. Right, so we did some research with Dr. Tracy Loriot, and he came up with the first definition for an open smart city. And that is one where all stakeholders collaborate to mobilize data and technologies in ways that are ethical, accountable, and transparent, right? So thus governing the city as a fair, viable, and livable commons. Balance economic development with social progress and environmental responsibility, right? So it's a very holistic approach. And this series is part of the Community Solution Network, which is a program of Future Cities Canada, led by our partner Evergreen, and us, we are the lead technical partner, right? And this program is funded by Infrastructure Canada. All right, and what we want to achieve with this program, our goal is really to help communities of all sizes across Canada help explore smart city approaches, and we do this by sharing information, building knowledge and capacity, and creating networks, right? So our role in this program, the Community Solution Network, we lead the advisory service, right? And we provide access to all of the participating communities, to leading experts, and also access to over 20 courses, both English and French, that cover topics of governance, data, IT, software, hardware, people engagement, right? All the topics related to open smart cities. And by the way, our online courses are open to the public for a limited amount of time, right? As a public user would have access to them for 3 months. And at the end of the webinar, we're going to share a link so you can go and join our learning management system so you can have access to these courses, right? If you would like to join. And just to give you a bit of context on this webinar series, right? As part of the Community Solution Network, we have invited experts to write about emerging smart city issues. And we've published a number of research briefs, right? Which you can also access at the Community Solutions portal. And we'll share the link to that in the chat box. And with this webinar series, we would really like to host conversations around these topics, right, on all of these research briefs, right? So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Karine. So Karine, please take it away.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be filling in a bit at the last minute as a moderator. I do have a special link to this bit of the panelist. I was involved in the project at Dawson College with Rachel who is one of our panelists. So I'm very happy to be filling in here. So I'm currently a research analyst with OpenNord. As I'm professional in geospatial data, and I've worked in food security as well. And I've also done work in data governance in fields such as real estate and urban planning, and also for defense and military. And so today's webinar is on food security and the policies around that in the context, as we mentioned, of Open Smart City. So today we'll hear from two panelists who have worked on a research brief on the issue of data collaboration amongst local community partners and what the lessons we can draw from these collaboration to address efforts around food insecurity, especially during the first wave of COVID-19 pandemic in Montreal. The pandemic was very important. Well, it has been a very big event worldwide, but it did highlight and underline the critical role of local governments and grassroots organization in rapidly responding to a complex economic and social challenges, which require a collaboration across a wide range of actors who all have a varying level, a degree of knowledge and capacity to meet the local community needs. And so the research brief that our panelists will be discussing identifies critical consideration for Open Smart City. The Open Smart City principle can be applied in data collaboration to identify community needs and foster trust and engagement amongst the actors and drive forward potential solution. Our panelists have focused on a main case study with two main actors, which is the Conseil Alimentaire du Grand Montréal, and also the data sharing platform, or 211. And so I will now introduce our panelists. And the first one is Anne-Marie Aubert. Anne-Marie Aubert is a specialist in the development of organizations and public policies. She has over 15 years of experience in federal politics and citizen mobilization. Her main coordinating role within Montreal is with the Métropole en Santé. Anne-Marie supports the development of the Conseil, the Food Policy Council of the Montreal agglomeration, and offers partners support in the development and implementation of their initiatives. Anne-Marie offers the organization that make up the Montreal food system places for exchange, sharing, and collaboration with the objective of establishing common intervention strategies. So welcome, Anne-Marie. Very happy that you're joining today.
Thanks, Karine.
And our second panelist is Rachel Begg, who is a doctoral candidate in anthropology at Concordia University. Her thesis research focuses on neighborhood resiliency and food security, particularly during times of crisis. Rachel works for the NDG Community Council as a community organizer, where she coordinates a neighborhood roundtable on food security. She is also a research assistant at Dawson College Food Justice Sustainability Hub. So welcome, Rachel. I'm looking forward to hearing both our panelists' expertise and the work they've done on the research brief.
Anne-Marie, would you like to
okay, should I jump right in here? Sure. Okay, so as Karine mentioned, I work with the Conseil du Système Alimentaire Montréalais, which is Montreal's Food Policy Council. And we were heavily involved in the emergency crisis group that the city put in place to help with emergency food relief during the pandemic crisis. So most of the examples that I'll be giving today will be in relation to that context. So why is data collaboration for policy important? Well, really because in that time of crisis, we need a whole community response. And when we're talking about the role of those regional actors, either the municipal government or other food banks or other actors, we're really dealing with the problem of efficient resource distribution. So during the crisis, what we saw was an immediate spike in food insecurity, a spike in the demand, not only because of the job losses that people were experiencing, but also because of the stay-at-home recommendations from public health. It made it harder for people to go out and get food, especially elderly people. So what we needed to do was to really deploy many more resources than that system is normally designed to handle. And the challenge that we saw, and where it comes, where we get to the data collaboration, is that there was a mismatch between the needs of the population, which were very easy to understand in terms of data. There's a lot of information available in terms of where the most vulnerable populations are. And in terms of COVID, those numbers in terms of most vulnerable populations to the pandemic were readily available. But what was hard to judge was the adequation between those needs and the resources that were being deployed. So one of the challenges that we faced was really how to go beyond the existing network in order to meet the needs of a larger part of the population. And that was in many ways stifled by the lack of visibility on those different channels and the logistics of getting the food to a broader public. So one of the key takeaways is that it's very difficult in the middle of a crisis to be building efficient infrastructure across a complex network of diverse regional and local actors. People will share information because they need to, but when it's not done in a standardized fashion, what happens is we don't end up getting outside of the channels that we usually have because there's not enough visibility about the capacity of different organizations, and we end up duplicating things. So for example, if we can take a more concrete example, the Table des Chefs started preparing frozen meals that could be distributed to the population. And there was a really massive production of these frozen meals, but it was very difficult for them to figure out, okay, who exactly are they going to deliver these meals to? Because they don't deliver directly to the population. They have to go via organizations that are already on the ground. And so frozen meals need to be kept in freezers, right? And the fact that there was no like database about where those organizations were and what their capacities were to actually store and then deliver these meals was really a factor that created like a stranglehold on the distribution of these resources. So we realize that now that kind of information, we need to have the infrastructure in order to collect and share that information so that we don't hold up the process of distributing those resources. I think another key takeaway though is despite the fact that there wasn't this infrastructure in place already, is that there were innovations that happened, there were interesting solutions that were brought forward. And in those cases, it was largely facilitated by the sharing of data between different organizations. So for example, one school board, as you know, many kids who live with food insecurity benefit from school food programs, but the schools were closed. So one school board decided that they would take the money that they had normally for that school food program and give it to a community organization who could provide food relief. And the barrier was to how to make sure that, well, the challenge was how to make sure that that organization would actually be able to reach those kids and their families. So they created a data sharing agreement where the schools were able to share with the organization the lists of the kids who normally receive food aid. And there are obviously concerns about confidentiality, concerns about whether or not they had the right to do to share that information, but they went and they got a legal the legal advice to make sure that they had the right to do it. And then they quickly put in place a protocol for sharing the data. And this resulted in entire neighborhoods being able to benefit from, continued food service in the midst of the crisis. So we see that there is there is a potential for enabling solutions through data sharing in that kind of context. And in terms of the last question, what have you learned and what would you change? I think in the brief, we didn't focus a lot on the need for a coordinating body to build that data sharing infrastructure and to help build local capacity for collecting and sharing data. And that's something that we became more conscious of in the wake of that crisis, where we're still emerging from. And so it's kind of a classic problem for a lot of organizations or partners that would like to collaborate, is that they don't necessarily have the resources or the tools to dedicate for the collaboration and cooperation portion of their work. You know, there are resources that are very much focused on their mission. So in this case, the organizations are focused on delivering the food aid. And so we're trying to develop spaces and capacity to really bolster the ability of these organizations to collect and share data, so that, and that doesn't happen on its own. It needs to be coordinated, and there needs to be an active leadership on that file. So I think that would be one of the, something I would add if I had to do it over again.
Okay, I think I'll jump in now. Thanks a lot, Anne-Marie. So just Karine mentioned a little bit at the beginning, but to kind of set the context of this slide on neighborhood perspective, I coordinate a food security table at the neighborhood level in a neighborhood in Montreal. And part of my role is to participate in ongoing collaborative research with a team at Dawson College. So that was an established role before COVID. And then during the pandemic, this neighborhood table that I coordinate became a cellule de crise, a local crisis table involved in food security that met a lot more frequently. So that's to set the context a little bit. So to build upon a few of the topics that Anne-Marie brought up, a few of the points for why is this important, data collaboration and food policy from a neighborhood perspective. I wanted to mention the importance of integration of existing community resources into municipal actions, and the emphasis that needs to be placed on creating these horizontal relationships with a broad array of local organizations and partners, which can directly enable communities as a whole to better respond to system level shocks. So for example, such as the COVID pandemic, as well as complex problems by mobilizing interorganizational networks and partnerships that underlie collaboration. So that's kind of broadly why the topic is important. Some of the key, or the two key takeaways I wanted to mention, I think go quite well hand in hand. One is focused on trust and the other one on innovation. So a lot of the research we've done focuses on trust as an established, a long-term established relationship. So we see this as trust as key for a successful collaboration built through these long-term relationships and partnerships as an ongoing process, and also the need for the establishment of trust to have short-term successes in order to see the benefit of collaboration. So this is something that's built over time and can start with a set governance structure at the beginning of a relationship, but needs to be continuously assessed, which can then lead to innovation, to spontaneous innovation during these collaborative research processes. And also that flexibility to change course when needed is important. So in a more concrete example, a lot of the research practices that we do at the Dawson team focuses on the method of DBIR, so data-based implementation research, which really focuses on ongoing relationships. So for example, with this food security community roundtable, that implementation matters when we're considering data sharing practices. And also that, as we saw in a time of crisis, that successful and rapid mobilization is possible, that it is most successful when there are pre-established longer-term relationships, which brings us back to trust. Again, this can be a challenge when mobilization needs to occur quite quickly, such as during a time of crisis. So for the question, what have you learned since you wrote the brief and what would you change? I'll just briefly mention this topic related to vulnerable populations, but I think it's worth coming back to in the question period. We wanted to emphasize that a lot of the focus that we have learned, or that has been reaffirmed during this time of crisis, is that focus should be on assessing who is most vulnerable, who is most in need, especially when considering data collaboration, and how are we addressing who is most in need with the goals that we set. So neighborhood level relationships are really essential to ensure that the right information and the right support reaches vulnerable populations from groups and organizations that they trust. And it's also worth mentioning that the kind of the question to put out there concerning how does the digital support the analog. So as Anne-Marie was mentioning, a lot of during this pandemic, it was evident that a lot of people didn't have access to cell phones or internet, and in a time when people are told to be remaining indoors and staying at home, and at the same time information is rapidly changing, it can be a challenge to know the best way to reach those more vulnerable or at-risk populations, especially when considering food insecurity. So I think I'll stop there for now, and we can continue in the question period.
Thank you to both Anne-Marie and Rachel for sharing your perspective and your lens on the research you've carried out. I'd like to ask three main questions for our panelists. I'll start with the first one, which I think really relates well to what Rachel, you've just mentioned around access to technology and having cell phones and that sort of thing during a time of a crisis. The first one that I'll ask is, and it's for both of our panelists, how can an open smart city lens better support social service delivery and collaboration among the partners? And I think, Rachel, you briefly touched on that. I don't know if you want to start there, or Anne-Marie, you can jump in, or vice versa.
Sure, maybe I'll continue a bit and then pass it off to Anne-Marie after. So in regards to open city, city lens supporting better social service delivery collaboration among partners, I think one topic that was important that we brought up during the brief was that neighborhood organizations, they often have a very great and very in-depth knowledge and capacity to respond to local needs. But often they lack proficiency in smart city vocabulary, or they may conceive of data or data gathering as kind of an extra, so something beyond their resource capabilities, particularly during a time of crisis. If this wasn't an established practice before, it can be very difficult to begin during a time of crisis. Yet also this information can be quite vital for funders. So something that we discussed in the brief is that data-driven and smart initiatives do have the capacity to improve their reach and impact in local communities, but they can also lack the vocabulary to translate this technological social innovation into goals that actually resonate with local organizations and communities. Also, some organizations can just be suspicious of data gathering, especially when a long-term trust building process hasn't been established. So this is something to be aware of, kind of the bridging of the gap, establishing relationships in a longer term strategy. And again, having small successes before I'm being distracted because it just started thunderstorming. Small successes that can lead to a longer term relationship. Maybe I'll pass it off to Anne-Marie now.
Sure, maybe just quickly, I think another way that the Smart City can support the collaboration is that the needs that arise for sharing information, data, they're really a catalyst, as Rachel was saying, for also creating new partnerships. So, for example, in this pandemic, the city, the services responsible for housing in the city, who normally don't deal with food insecurity directly as an issue or food distribution, they were mobilized to share data with a local organization, La Cantine pour tous, who provide like catering services or prepared meals for that can be delivered into those places. So they set up a new collaboration where this information was shared. People who lived in social housing were able to benefit, like to order meals at a low cost, or to ask for free meals also that were prepared by La Cantine pour tous. So you can see how just the fact of sharing that information really opened up doors for collaboration around the delivery of the food aid. So I think that's just another example of how the collaboration around the data leads to other kinds of partnerships.
Thank you for both your responses. The next question is a bit building on what I think some of the elements that both of you have mentioned. And Marie, you've spoken about some opportunities, Rachel, some of the maybe some challenges. And the next question focuses a bit more around the challenges and barriers, but feel free to jump in and add like the opportunities, that like how these challenges and barriers can be changed into opportunities as well. So in your opinions, what are the biggest challenges and barriers to coordination on information and data in an emergency response?
I would take it back to the point I was making at the beginning about resource distribution, and really trying to look at the matching of the needs of the population and the resources that are available. We have a lot of information and data on the population and their needs, but we know that the current system of food aid that's in place really doesn't reach a lot of those people. But the problem is the resources that are deployed are through a wide variety of channels. And there was no one place where the information about those various organizations and how much food they distribute and what neighborhoods they covered was readily available, and much less so up to date. So that was really one of the biggest challenges, is that you have all this information about the needs, and you know a lot about different groups and the resources that and services that they offer. But because it's not collected in a standardized manner, it's very, very difficult to have a clear idea of, are those needs being met? So, for example, many organizations don't necessarily identify the people that they give their services to. And they started during the pandemic to share lists, to kind of keep tabs on who was going where, and to make sure that people were getting the resources. But there was really no system in place for that, for sharing that information properly. And so what it reads is a really big blind spot in terms of, okay, if there are two food banks in one neighborhood and they each serve 50 people, is it the same 50 people, or is it 100 people, and we don't know that. So those are barriers right now, and as we were during the pandemic, because without that kind of information, it's hard to have a real picture of whether or not the needs are being met.
Yeah, to continue on this thread of knowledge of needs being met, as Anne-Marie was saying, like knowing who's being served by, or how many people are being served by which food bank, and the overlap. I think sometimes there is knowledge of this overlap, which isn't necessarily always a bad thing, but sometimes information is lacking on what gaps there are in coverage. And for example, with the distribution of gift cards through an organization, Second Harvest, for gift cards to purchase food, it can be hard to know who, again, which is not at all a bad thing, who is receiving more than one gift card from a different organization, but also who is not being served by any of these organizations and perhaps maybe falling through the cracks. And also, maybe correct me on this, Anne-Marie, if I'm explaining it wrong, but since the pandemic, Moisson Montréal, one of I guess Montreal's biggest food distributor to food banks and community food organizations, which then distribute further on to participants, they're now asking for more detailed information for their funders on how many people are being served by each organization, quite detailed information that some organizations haven't collected in the past for various reasons, either with particularly vulnerable populations that may not be willing to share this information, but still need to access these services. And then the only other thing I want to mention in relation to challenge on a very basic level, I think at the neighborhood level, at least, we did have, before the pandemic, a fairly established network of organizations working together who were working in food security, but we had never really needed or explored the lines of communication or resource distribution from a top-down approach. It was very more horizontal network set up. So even just knowing from the borough level of who to contact in the neighborhood who would be coordinating such a response was dealing with bureaucracy during a time of crisis really seemed to slow the flow of information. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, did you have something to add on this, or I saw you unmute? Okay.
Yeah, I'm just thinking maybe just to actually answer the question, because we talked about the problems when data is not shared, but why is it not shared? I think a lot of it is like in the specific example that we were giving about collecting data on the people who go to the food banks, is that there are a lot of concerns about creating barriers to access, so that if we're asking a lot of questions of people when they come, it stigmatizes them, and it will prevent people from coming and accessing those services. And then there's also concerns about the confidentiality and how that data would be kept secure, and if it were to be shared between organizations, how would it be done in a secure manner? So I think those are some of the challenges that explain why that data wasn't available and wasn't being shared or collected.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very important point, and it's very relevant, I think. You both touched on the last question and throughout this discussion on the pandemic. And previously we talked about emergency response as more of a broader level, general scope. I'd like to narrow it down a bit now and ask you, what have we learned from the pandemic and how to share data effectively.
I can go ahead, Rachel, and let you finish. Well, I think one of the things we learned is that more people need to be involved in the collecting and the sharing of data. So in particular, when the kind of data that we would like is about frontline organizations, as I mentioned before, they don't necessarily have the capacity to be collecting and sharing that data. So for example, the 211, which is a database and a website about available resources for food relief. Normally, the way that system worked is that once a year, 211 would send out a message to all of the frontline organizations, asking them to update their sheet, their file, their profile, if you will, on their website, and then that would be updated and it would be kept that way. Obviously, during the pandemic, organizations were closing, reopening, changing their services, adapting their services, and their priority is not to like go online to this portal and update it for the 211. They're in the thick of delivering the services. So one thing that ended up happening is that other partners were brought in, like us at the Conseil, or also with the different table de quartier. 211 kind of opened up this process so that we could help with the updating of the information, so that people who were in those local cells, as Rachel was talking about, or even in other groups that weren't exactly on the frontline services, but were familiar with the neighborhoods and familiar with what was going on with those groups, they could help validate and update the data and do it on a more regular basis. So that was one thing, is that it's not necessarily just those who have who are the first users who can be involved in the collecting and sharing. And then I think the other thing is that we saw that people will share the data when they need it. That will happen, and when people are proactive, they'll find ways to get the information shared, and in order to build solutions. But it won't get to like a critical mass in it, and the critical mass necessary to inform like regional decisions about distribution of resources until there are some shared tools and practices that will create the infrastructure for this to happen. So out of the pandemic, we've started being more conscious of the need for that role and thinking about what we can offer in that sense. But those would be the main things that I think we learned.
Something I wanted to mention in relation to what we've learned from the pandemic, how to share data effectively. On a very basic level, I think the acceptance that we do need to learn how to share data and information, research related, more effectively and more fairly has propelled the research team I'm part of at Dawson, and actually we should mention is led by Analyst, who's the first author on our brief. We're really interested in continuing our funded research on this topic of trust building around data and open smart city communities, specifically dedicated to the creation and establishment of a neighborhood level best practices when considering research, ethical considerations when conducting research with residents, so particularly with vulnerable populations who may opt in to participate in research or to share information that we collect. So we're hoping to kind of set up a way of establishing a way to have participative research, including forums that creates this code of conduct best practices, which would include best ways of data sharing practices. We really see this responsibility of researchers to not only respect participants or respect residents that become involved in this, but also for there to be tangible benefits back to the community for participation in research. And that can include social service delivery. So that's something, I guess, what we have learned is the need that there does need to be an ongoing process of how does data collaboration, what does it look like, and also how does it benefit all of those who are involved.
All right, I think this concludes our questions section of the panel, right? Thanks so much, Karine, for moderating this discussion. Thank you, Anne-Marie and Rachel as well for this really interesting conversation, right? I really personally really find that this discussion really shows us how relevant an open smart city approach is to data collaboration in the context of an emergency like this one, right? Of course, it has its challenges, but I think at the end of the day, it might be the most beneficial, mutually beneficial path forward if you consider the entire community as a whole, right? So that's great. So now we're gonna move to the Q&A session. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. Let's take a look at what we have here in the chat box. All right, so I would suggest that we just go over what we have in the chat box, and then we can open it up to everybody here in the room to either ask your question out loud, right? You're free to unmute yourself, or you can also write it down, right? Either way is fine with us. All right. Okay. So I see, Baldwin, I see you have a few questions here. Thanks so much for your question. Really interesting. But I would just suggest maybe choosing one, if that's okay, right? And then if we have more time in the end, we're gonna revisit the other questions that you have. All right. If you're here, I would just suggest you to maybe unmute if you want to ask it out loud, or I can also, or you can also just write your question, the question they would like to ask first in the chat box. Either way is fine with us.
Hi there. Okay.
Oh, hey.
I guess I can ask the third one. I'll just try to remember it because I don't have the chat box up right now. It was regarding, I guess, the sort of historic monoculture of food policy groups and sort of the people that they serve in the end in the cities. And I'm wondering that with sort of a fairly diverse population that we have now in our cities, how do we build these systems so that both the systems and the foods and especially culturally appropriate foods that we have available, or food resources that we have available for our communities, are there for them in the way and places and times that they need them? Thanks.
All right, great question, Baldwin. Anne-Marie, I see you unmuted yourself. Would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, and then Rachel, feel free if you want to add something.
Right.
Yeah, I think this is an issue that is more and more front of mind, and really many of our partners are recognizing that issue and talking about it. In terms of the current state of food relief, one thing that happened recently was in our last action plan, Montreal did a project where they did like a recensement, sorry, losing my words, but a survey of what all the available places of food relief were. And so they went beyond their own membership and they identified a lot of other organizations. And in many cases, they were like churches or mosques or cultural centers that were not like their mission, their first reason for existence wasn't necessarily to offer food relief, but because they were embedded in different diverse communities, they had developed that as part of their services. So that project helped to give a more diverse picture of what's actually out there in terms of food relief. And I think the next step is then to ask the question, okay, well, how come they're not accredited with Montreal? Many of them just through that process then decided to seek accreditation and now are part of that network. So that's just one network. I mean, but I think it's a good example of how even just reaching out and identifying and acknowledging those organizations that aren't already part of the network can be a step towards better inclusion. But I think that there's a lot more to be done, and I don't have an answer, but I can talk about one other idea that's being discussed right now, which is creating partnerships between organizations that already have expertise in the logistics of food aid, because there's a lot of technical details around transportation, processing, hygiene rules, etc. And organizations that, like I said, don't necessarily have a background in delivering those services, but are already embedded in the communities where now the needs are most present. So the idea, for example, with when funders put out a call for projects for new food relief related projects, instead of going to those same food organizations that are traditionally active, to foster those partnerships so that new types of organizations that are more embedded in the diverse communities can benefit from the experience of those groups, but be the ones to take the lead on a project like that because they know those communities better. So that's just one idea of many of how to meet the needs of a more diverse population.
And to build off of what Anne-Marie is saying, I think in relation to the establishment of food policies or research related to food policies, that one idea also is or one ongoing project is to really encourage, not only encourage, but to seek out participants that, as you say in your question, are from a more diverse population that may be accessing some of these or in a more vulnerable position, accessing some of these food needs, to be not only participants in the research, but also researchers as kind of neighborhood leads or established community actors, and to have not only the pulling out of single voices, but to have them play a dominant role in this research. Also, I see Caitlin from the Depot. I don't want to single the Depot out, but this is a community food center who recently had a participant who uses their food bank services, food resources, become part of their board, one of their board members. And I think that ongoing establishment of not having such a separation when creating these policies, research, even board members of an organization, but having a more community integration is a good way forward.
Great. Thank you both, Anne-Marie and Rachel. All right, so maybe we'll go with the next question in the chat, right? So we have one from Megan. I'm wondering how to balance the focus on established relationships in addressing crisis versus and inclusion of underrepresented voices / people who may not already be involved. Were there any strategies you tried to build new / less established relationships and trust? Would like to answer that?
I have a short answer. As I mentioned, one of the involvements that we had during the crisis was with the regional emergency cell that the city put in place. And one of the mandates that we had was to do a plan to prepare for the second wave. So this was back at the beginning of the pandemic in late spring 2020. And we realized that one of the missing pieces of the information, what was available to us, was really the point of view of the most vulnerable people who were being affected. So what we did at that point is we created a partnership with an organization called ATD Carmonde, who are specialized in the mobilization of people who live with poverty. And we set up a focus group around with some of their members about the issue of food insecurity, and it really enabled us to understand some of the barriers to accessing services, the different ways in which people appreciate or appreciate less the services that are on offer, etc. So I can't say that it was necessarily a sustained element of the entire sort of strategic response, but there was an effort that was made to kind of reach out, because we did recognize that there were key voices that were not being heard, and we were able to integrate some of the quotes from that discussion into the report that we made back to the table.
I think the only thing I can think of to mention in addition to the answer to the previous question is I work for a local community organization, the Community Council in DG, and during the pandemic, we really tried to find a balance between the work that community organizers and community workers which we're doing, which sometimes doesn't have a strong overlap, but community workers are often out on the streets working directly with residents, while organizers are working with members of different organizations at roundtables, etc. But having a really direct line of communication between different people who are working with different voices in the community, which during the crisis happened to be a lot of combination of door-to-door and phone calls with seniors in HLMs or other people who may not have access to other methods of communication during a crisis. I think a strategy would be to build upon these different lines of communication.
All right, this is great. Thank you, Anne-Marie and Rachel. So we're almost at time already. So I think I'll just conclude the event, and then I'm wondering if anybody can stay maybe a few minutes after noon, maybe to answer a few questions. Anne-Marie, Rachel, would you have a bit of time, just actually past one, just to answer anyone else's questions?
Sure.
Is that okay? Okay, cool, no problem. So we just officially conclude the event, right? And then after that, we can whoever wants to stick around for a bit longer to ask you questions, you can stay. All right, I'm just gonna share my screen again. Okay. All right, so thanks again. Oops, this one, sorry about that. So this brings us to our conclusion, right? Again, it's said that we don't have more time, because honestly, I think we could just keep going and going to talk about this topic, right? Because it's so relevant at this day and age, especially considering the pandemic and all its lingering impacts, right? Smart-city solutions become more and more relevant. So really would like to know from you, what do you think of this event? Right, so you see there's a poll right now in front of you. We really invite you to take your time, just take a minute to answer these questions. They really help us in improving this series, right? So we just leave it up for a minute.
And I think as we're waiting for everyone to fill out the evaluation survey, maybe you can just share a little bit more about the advisory service and some of our upcoming webinars.
Mm-hmm. Sure, no problem. All right. So, okay, Sure, no problem. So if you would like to stay in touch with us, right, know more about what we do, you can either follow us on Twitter or subscribe to our newsletter, right? We should have a link in the chat box with all of that, right? And we're also sharing our LMS, our learning management system, right? If you would like to sign up for and take some of our courses, all right? So we have an upcoming webinar on July 14th, right, on procurement and mobility. So we're really looking forward to that one, and we really hope that you're able to join us again. All right. So thanks again for joining us today, and we really hope to see you in our next series. And again, for those who would like to ask you questions, you can stay, right? And you're free to ask them right now, right?